So I'm going to ask Mike Yee, step on up. And I'd like you to introduce Brian to everybody, please.
Thanks, Mel. So Dr. Brian Ginn has been the limnologist or lake doctor at Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority since 2008. And he heads their lake science and monitoring program. He has a PhD in limnology from Queen's University and is one of 3 lake managers in Canada certified by the North American Lake Management Society. And I've been working for years to try and get Dr. Ginn to share his knowledge in Eastern Ontario. And it's taken this long, so it's nice to have him here. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian to share the lessons learned on Lake Simcoe.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be here. So somebody's working my slides, I think.
I'm going to work your slides, so you just tell me when to advance them.
Great. Yeah, so what I'll be talking about today is the Health of Lake Simcoe. So if you can just flip to the next slide there, Mel. So I usually start out with this kind of satellite shot. It's a family portrait, if you will, of the Great Lakes region. And Lake Simcoe, I've circled it in yellow down there. It's halfway between Lake Ontario and the Georgian Bay portion of Lake Huron. We're the largest lake in south central Ontario, 722 square kilometers. It makes up about 20% of the entire watershed. And there's probably about 500,000 permanent residents that live within the watershed. And then there's probably another 50 to 100,000 cottagers and seasonal people that come up during the year. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a zoomed in Google Earth shot of Lake Simcoe. So this is what it looks like. There's 3 main lake areas we'll be talking about today. Most of the lake is what they just call the main basin or the main lake when people go fishing on it. That kind of arm off to the left or the west is Kempenfelt Bay. So that's the deepest part of the lake. Maximum depth is 136 feet or 42 meters. That kind of grayish, whitish area kind of on the far left, that's the city of Barrie. That's probably the largest city within the watershed. And then down on the south is Cook's Bay, which is kind of a shallow, nutrient-enriched area, receives water inputs from the Holland Marsh, where most of Ontario's carrots and onions come from, and also from the towns of Aurora and Newmarket, which are just south and off that satellite shot. Next slide, please. So our role in lake research in the Conservation Authority, we're one of 36 conservation authorities from across Ontario. And it's nice to see some colleagues here from Cataraqui, Rideau Valley. I think I saw Mississippi Valley on there as well. So our main difference is that we have this large lake in the center of it. So in 2008, we started a lake science program. Historically, water quality monitoring and environmental monitoring on the lake was under the jurisdiction of the province, Ministry of the Environment, since 1980. Has been looking after offshore water quality, algae studies, reports of pollution, and so on. And Ministry of Natural Resources and Fisheries since the 1950s, 1960s has been looking after things fish-related on the lake. This left a data gap in what we call the nearshore zone or the shallow water part of the lake, basically anything shallower than a water depth of around 20 meters, which makes up about 2/3 of the lake area. And that's our role at the Conservation Authority, is monitoring the shallow water, comparing it with the offshore or the deeper water results. We also look at things like aquatic plant communities, benthic invertebrates, so the biology, invasive species, and so on. One of the things that we do is we address the concerns of lake residents. Having Lake Simcoe in our name, when you type Lake Simcoe into Google, I think we're the first or second hit that comes up, so you get a lot of inquiries about the lake. And a lot of our research is basically addressing questions that people had about the lake. So things like, why are there so many aquatic plants? What's the role of invasive species? How's the water changing over time? Oh yeah, and we also investigate new and emerging issues that are going on in Lake Simcoe. So next slide, please. So the 3 main key or environmental stressors to Lake Simcoe are the same as those across the Great Lakes region. Phosphorus, which is a limiting nutrient, how much is getting into the lake, how much is inside the lake water, its role in promoting aquatic plant growth and algal blooms, And then when these things die and decompose, consequences to lessening amounts of deep water oxygen, and that impacts the cold water fish community. Invasive species, invasive aquatic plants, invasive algae, zebra and quagga mussels are in the lake. They're probably two of the most famous across southern Ontario. And then the role that they have and the impact on native biological communities. And then finally, climate change, which is a global issue, but it's also affecting here at the local level as well. So it's not just warmer air temperatures, which lead to warmer water temperatures, shortened period of ice cover. It's also changing precipitation pattern, and this impacts things like with rainfall falling in different ways, how phosphorus gets into the lake. Climate change makes it easier for invasive species to survive, that sort of thing. So these three stressors are not really separate, but they're kind of integrated with each other, and they kind of team up and act, causing these large-scale environmental changes on the lake. Next slide. So the first thing I'll mention from our research on Lake Simcoe is climate change. This graph here shows the days of ice cover on Kempetfelt Bay, so that kind of western arm that goes up to the city of Barrie on the lake. We have the advantage that we have one of the longest ice records in Canada from 1852 right through to present day. They've been monitoring the ice on this bay. There has been a significant decrease in the amount of ice cover. At the start of the record, it's about 126 days of ice cover on Kempetfelt Bay, and now it's just over 90. Back in 1852, 1873, I think the ice formed on the lake on average around December 19th. Now it doesn't usually freeze over until January 10th. And the same thing, average day of ice off in the first part of the record was in late April, and now it's early to mid-April. So decrease in ice cover just from warming temperature. Also, zebra and quagga mussels made the water clearer, so sunlight can penetrate deeper, which warms up the water more, which means that it's taking longer for the lake to freeze, so it's warmer for a longer period. And also that warm water period where the lake is separated into a warm water layer on top of a colder water layer has increased by a month since the 1980s with our lake monitoring. And it's not just the top layer that's warming up. I think last year we recorded our warmest ever water temperature. In June 2020, we hit 27 degrees in the offshore area of Lake Simcoe. That's also being reflected in the deep water temperatures as well. So they've warmed up by about 4 degrees since the early 1980s. Next slide, please. So that's climate change. Another thing, which is the main topic of environmental discussion on the lake, is phosphorus. And what's the deal with phosphorus? So it's really a limiting nutrient. It's naturally found in small amounts, but people add it to their gardens and so on to make their lawns and their gardens green. And the same thing, if it makes your lawn and garden green, when it gets into your watershed, it also makes your lake and rivers green as well. So that bottom picture is just an algal bloom from Lake Erie, and that's kind of an extreme case of what can happen. So too much phosphorus running off the landscape and entering your lake causes the algal blooms and excessive plant growth. It's what we process we call eutrophication, which is just basically nutrient enrichment. And when these plants and algae decompose, it reduces the amount of oxygen, and then you get further problems from that as well. Next slide. So the current lake management plan on Lake Simcoe is the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. It's a provincial act that came into effect in June 2009. And really it's set out to restore Lake Simcoe to a more sustainable state. At its heart, it's based on the cold water fish community. Lake Simcoe is one of the recreational fishing capitals in Ontario. And two of the species that people target are lake trout and lake whitefish. These are called cold water species because they can't tolerate warm water. So when the water warms up during the summertime, they tend to sink down to the deeper areas of the lake and hang out where it's nice and cool. Unfortunately, this is also the part of the lake that towards the end of summer tends to run out of oxygen as well. So to have a healthy and happy cold water fish community, lots of lake trout, lots of lake whitefish, the target for dissolved oxygen is around 7 milligrams per liter. And because phosphorus is linked to these dissolved oxygens, when you back calculate that through in the models, it works out to an estimated phosphorus loading per year of 44 tons of phosphorus. And so that's the amount of phosphorus that we want to see moving into Lake Simcoe. And that's kind of our guideline that we've been hitting for. Next slide, please. So we're rather unique in that we don't actually model our phosphorus load. We've got a crackerjack team of permanent and contract technicians that go out year round, and they're actually measuring components of the phosphorus load. So they're out on the tributaries, measuring the sources of urban runoff, natural runoff, runoff from farms and agriculture, the amount that blows in through the atmosphere, and the amount that's leaching in from water treatment plants and also septic systems as well. And an interesting fact, they collect about more than 3 million data points per year to use to calculate these phosphorus loads on Lake Simcoe. So next slide, I think, is a graph showing the trends in the phosphorus load and also tributary flow volume. So this bar graph just shows the amount of phosphorus that we've recorded moving into Lake Simcoe. So the height of the bars is the total phosphorus load per year. And that goes from the year 2000 right through the year 2017-18. Those years at the bottom are the hydrological year, which is a bit different from the calendar year. So it starts off on June the 1st and it goes through to the following May 31st. So that last bar there is 2017-18, starts off on June 1st, 2017, moves through to May 31st, 2018. So the height of the bars is the phosphorus load. That black line is across the center is our 44-ton loading target. And the different colors on the bar show the different sources. And the tributaries are the green, for example, red sewage treatment plant and so on. That kind of icy blue kind of mountain range in the background, that's the flow volume coming out of the tributaries. And you can see the years with the high loading, so example 2017, 2013, 2008 or so on. They also correspond to the highest amount of water coming out of the tributaries. So there's a higher volume of water that's being pushed out of the tributaries, which is bringing a lot of phosphorus with it. That's driving up the phosphorus load. The two graphs at the bottom, so the phosphorus loads are what's going into the lake. The two graphs at the bottom show the actual in-lake conditions. So in-lake phosphorus, the amount that's dissolved in lake water, showing a different trend from up above for the phosphorus loads are going up and down. Since the 1980s, there's been a continuous improvement in lake phosphorus. And currently the 5-year average is around 7.3 micrograms per liter, which meets the provincial water quality objective of less than 10. Conversely, in the end of summer dissolved oxygen conditions shows an increase since the 1980s, so also an improving trend, also good news. And we're getting very close to that 7 milligrams per liter target that we want. And the last 5 years has been around 6.2 milligrams per liter. Next slide, please. So that leads us to a question of what exactly is going on in Lake Simcoe. And this is something that we've put together in the last few years, and our research this year and last year and moving forward is kind of what's going on with Lake Simcoe and why is it different from almost any other lake that we've been looking at. Lake science theory says if you increase the amount of phosphorus going into a lake, you're going to increase the concentration in the lake, and it's going to lead to lower amounts of oxygen. So in theory, on that last year, 27-18, the loading was 131 tons. Should have given us a phosphorus concentration conservatively somewhere between 13 and 18, and your oxygen should have been very low in the fall. What actually happened was the lake continued on how it has been on average for the past 5 or 10 years, and the same thing, oxygen continued to be relatively good to what it was. Next slide, please. So our research question is what's going on in Lake Simcoe and why is this different? And this is really where science gets interesting, is that you're looking at stuff that hasn't really been seen before. And we've got 3 kind of key research areas that we've been looking at. One of these is climate change and hydrology. Also, there's biological changes in the lake, and finally invasive species might be having a role. And that's what I'll be talking about in the forthcoming slides. Next slide. So the first of these is climate change. There's no doubt that the climate is changing. Most people correspond that with global warming and warmer temperatures in the air, but it's not just warming temperatures, it's also precipitation patterns are changing. In Lake Simcoe, we're getting, our storms are falling in different ways. In the summertime, we're getting more of these intense summer storms which dump a lot of rain in a short period of time. I think 2-3 weeks ago, we had 2 days that we had 100 millimeters of rain dumped on us. So basically a month's worth of rain in 2 days. 2 pictures on the right-hand side show the effect of one of these storms in 2017. There's what we call the Ghost Canal moving through one of our municipalities, Newmarket. It was basically like the Rideau Canal was being built, only after they had it completed, they found out there wasn't enough water to actually move the ships back and forth. So we have the remnants of this canal, and it's used for walking trails now. So on that canal wall, you can see a typical June day in the first picture, and then after a storm at the bottom, you can see where there was so much rain dumped, it overtopped that canal wall and caused flooding in this town. And this storm actually dumped 12.6 tons of phosphorus in 2 days and flooded it into the lake. Also in wintertime, we're getting more rain instead of snow. Rain on frozen ground just runs right off and again causes flooding similar to what you're seeing during the summer storms. So it's these fast storms and these rain and winter that are delivering phosphorus differently than what it was before. In the past, it was able to absorb into the soils. Now it's running right off into the tributaries. And again, it's these extreme events that are driving up phosphorus loading. Next slide. We also have invasive species in the lake. We have 2 species of the invasive mussels, the zebra mussels and the quagga mussels. They look almost identical unless you know how to tell them apart. Zebra mussels have kind of flat on one side, so if you stand them up on their bottom side, they'll stand upright, whereas a quagga mussel is kind of curved and they tend to topple over. It's a quick and dirty way to tell them apart. Zebra mussels arrived in Lake Simcoe first in the early 1990s. They have what I call the live fast, die young lifestyle. They require a lot of food, they need warm water, and they need hard substrates to attach to. So they get in there first, they change the environment, but then they eventually eat themselves out of house and home, and they eventually go through a population crash within 2 or 3 years after first arriving. Quagga mussels, I call them version 2.0 of zebra mussels. They're more adapted to surviving in the conditions which limit the zebra mussels. They can survive in cold water. They can survive periods of low food. They can even live on muddy substrates. And when both of these mussels are in a water body, they tend to replace the zebra mussels after about 7 to 9 years of coexistence. Next slide. So one study that we did in 2009-2015, we actually went out and took 744 samples from across the lake and found out where zebra and quagga mussels were growing. So these maps just show location of where the mussels were. This first slide shows the zebra mussels. Anything that's blue on that map is where the zebra mussels were found. The darker the blue color means the higher amount of zebra mussels. And you can see in 2009, they're kind of limited from the deep water of the lake because there's a change in substrate to kind of a muddy bottom, and zebra mussels get smothered out when they get in these high silt areas. 2015, we went back and we redid this. Large decrease in the amount of zebra mussels, and in fact today you'll be very hard pressed to find an actual zebra mussel on Lake Simcoe. There's a few in Cooks Bay, a few in Barrie, and that's pretty much it for the lake. Next slide is that second species. The quagga mussels show an opposite trend. They show a large increase between 2009 and 2015. As I said, they're the more advanced version of these invasive species. They can survive on silt, and by 2015, and even now, they dominate the benthic population in the lake, and they're found right from the shallowest waters right to the deepest parts, and they can survive on this muddy bottom in the lake. Next slide. So both types of these mussels are filter feeders, which means they remove algae and particles from the water. Each mussel can filter about 1 gallon of water a day. And when you calculate that out through based on the population that's in Lake Simcoe, they can filter a volume equivalent to the entire lake in a little under 3 days. A lot of these algae and particles have phosphorus in them, so they're actually stripping the phosphorus from the water column. And recent research this year, there was a few scientific papers that were published that show that these quagga mussels are the dominant controllers of phosphorus in the lower Great Lakes. They're actually changing how phosphorus is being distributed in the lake water and then up in through the food chain. Removing all these particles, of course, leads to an increase in water clarity, which leads to more aquatic plants. But they're not just increasing water clarity and removing particulate phosphorus, they're leaking out dissolved phosphorus, which is another form of this nutrient, which of course is used by plants. So next slide, please. So aquatic plants at the Conservation Authority, they're probably the public's #1 lake concern. Over half of all the phone calls we receive during the year are people's opinions on aquatic plants. So the one thing that people seem to love to hate. They are legally protected in Ontario. Just because you don't like them, you can't run down to the lake and start ripping them out off the bottom. They're important fish habitat in nurseries. And a colleague of mine says, plants are to bass and perch exactly what forests are to deer on land. So they're required by a lot of these important and recreationally important fish species. They also buffer wave action and tend to reduce erosion on people's property as well. And they're supposed to be there. They're naturally present in healthy lakes. And every lake nerd has a favorite plant species. This is mine. That's common bladderwort. It's actually a carnivorous form. It's got little bladders that can eat tiny zooplankton and tiny animals that are in the lake. So it's kind of a neat species. So plants are supposed to be there, but it's when the amount increases with nutrients and also increased water clarity. That's when they tend to become a problem, and that's when people start complaining about it. So next slide, please. So just like those mussel maps that I showed you before, we also went out and we surveyed aquatic plants from across the lake. So we've done this 3 times now. Every 5 years we go out and we do a large lake-wide plant survey. The green areas on those maps show where the plants were found in Lake Simcoe, and the more of the darker green color means the higher amount or the higher abundance of plants. And the take-home message here is over a 10-year period, plants increased about 5-fold. So there's a 5-fold increase in the amount of aquatic plants, and this increase is mainly one invasive species that now makes up about 2/3 of the entire plant community in the lake. Next slide, please. And that invasive species is Starry stonewort. It's not actually a plant, it's a macroalgae, which means it has more in common with seaweed that you find on the ocean shore than it does with aquatic plants in our lake. Probably came from Europe and Asia, and it's causing problems across the Great Lakes region, south central Ontario, and also in upstate New York, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and so on. It's actually an endangered species in its native range, so if anybody can find out how I can send it back to them, if you're happy to help pay for the FedEx bill, I'd be more than happy to send it back. It was first discovered in the St. Lawrence River south of Montreal in 1974, and it arrived in Lake Simcoe in 2009 is when I first found it. It has male and female plants, but in the Great Lakes region, people have only ever seen the male plants, so that's why we know it is invasive. The females are only found in its native range. Because it has more in common with seaweed, it doesn't really have any roots that attach it to the water, and that makes it a little different from other aquatic plants. So all its nutrients have to come from the surrounding water, and these nutrients are that dissolved phosphorus, which is being put out by the zebra and the quagga mussels. And so the picture on the right-hand side just kind of shows one individual, what it looks like, and then it tends to form these giant mounds or these mats and these walls of plant material. And that's what that second picture kind of on the left-hand side shows. It's an underwater photo of what it looks like in the water. Next slide, please. So trends in Starry stonewort, so these again are just those plant maps showing the spread of where it was found. We found none in 2008, 2009 we found the first evidence of it, and by 2018 it was spread pretty much lake-wide across the lake, and a large increase, and there's so much of it, it makes up about 2/3 of the aquatic plant species. It's now the dominant shallow water species, and it's even displaced other fairly aggressive invasive species such as Eurasian water milfoil from the lake. Next slide. So Starry stonewort in Ontario, I call it the under the radar invader. It's not widely reported. A lot of people don't recognize it until it's too late. And up until this past summer, it wasn't even listed on Ontario's invasive species reporting website. They only reported plants and animals because it's an algae. It kind of fell into this kind of gap in between them. So I started calling around neighboring conservation authorities and lake associations and cottage associations and so on, seeing if they had found this species. So Lake Simcoe is kind of on the left-hand side of that map, and those pink pins kind of show where it was found across those lakes. Next slide, please. So if you overlay that yellow line as a map of the Trent Severn Waterway, which shows how it probably arrived in Lake Simcoe and all those inside lakes. So Trent Severn Waterway is probably the Highway 401 for invasive species across the center part of the province, and it migrated from Lake Ontario through to Georgian Bay. Next slide, please. So what are the consequences to shallow water habitats? If you will, if you think of a plant community, it's almost like a little underwater forest. The plants have thin stalks, bushy tops. There's lots of kind of nooks and crannies for fish to hide out in, small bait fish and so on, perch and so on are in there. Predator fish such as muskie and pike and so on tend to hide out, and then they jump out at their prey as they go past. Next slide, please. What it looks like with Starry stonewort, the Starry stonewort forms pretty much a wall, pushes all those smaller fish offshore into less sheltered areas. And the same thing, pike and muskie, they can't use what's called ambush predation now. They have to chase down their prey, more like a lion, if you will, chasing a gazelle across the savannah. And that has an impact on the health and quality of these fish species as well. Next slide. So the approach we take to lake health is a holistic approach. Phosphorus gets a lot of attention, but it's not the be-all and end-all, depending on what your lake is. I always liken it to if we go in for a medical checkup, if they take your cholesterol level, that tells you one thing, but it doesn't tell you a lot about your overall health. You have to look at different things: lung function, age, activity, your family history, your blood count, your heart rate, and so on, bone density, stress level, your weight level, that sort of thing. They take all these into account to decide how healthy a person you are. Exactly the same thing with lakes. Phosphorus gets a lot of attention, but we look at probably 350 to 400 other indicators as well to see how healthy Lake Simcoe is. So there's a lot more going on than just the phosphorus loads that get reported, and that seemed to get a lot of the public attention. Next slide. What can the average person do to help with your lake? First of all, lake associations are a great help to us in our work. We have citizen science that goes out and takes some samples for us. We can't be everywhere on the lake 365 days a year. We depend on people's eyes and ears to report unusual things that they've seen. If you're a homeowner along the lake, maintain your septic systems as a way to prevent nutrients from going in. If you're a gardener, even fairly inshore from the lake, so towns of Aurora and Newmarket are about 40 kilometers away from the lake, all that phosphorus travels downhill into the lake water. So garden with phosphorus-free fertilizer, use native plants, compost, and so on. If you're a shoreline owner, stabilize your shorelines and also plant buffer zones to try and keep those nutrients back. And for boaters, respect no wake zones. A lot of that phosphorus going into the lake and so on is from erosion from the side. If you're a boater going between lakes, be sure to clean, drain, and dry your boat completely when traveling between the lakes. Those mussels, an adult quagga mussel can survive 7 days in dry air, 30 degrees Celsius during the summertime out of water. And that's lots of time for somebody who boats on the weekend to get from one area of the province to another. And the same thing, the larvae of those mussels can survive 30 days with just a little bit of water in that bilge. And also for Lake Simcoe, we're restricted. You can only use local bait around here because of fish disease and so on. That's being transported between them. So buy local bait and also don't dump your bait into the water bodies. Next slide, please. So in summary, just to wrap up, overall, for all the attention that gives, Lake Simcoe itself is doing quite well, but there are some challenges. These extreme rain events are driving up the phosphorus loads and the nutrient concentrations, and our research now is, why is Lake Simcoe not responding the way we think it should, the way every other lake that's been studied has responded? The Lake Simcoe seems to be. Invasive species have restructured the lake and its food web. And it's interesting to think that quagga mussels, the way they're redoing the phosphorus cycling, and that starry stonewort, the way it's taking up another part of phosphorus as well, they may be actually buffering Lake Simcoe from these environmental changes that we should be seeing. Lakes are complex systems. Lake Simcoe probably has about 10,000 species. Each one has countless genetic varieties. They're interacting with each other. They're interacting with the physical and the chemical parts of the lake as well. And changes in one area may have unexpected consequences down there. And that's one reason why we need targeted monitoring and really find out our answers, and also to fully evaluate what's going on. So I think that is it, and I'd be happy if anybody has any questions, type them in the chat, and if we don't get to them in the next 4 or 5 minutes, I'd be happy to, I can hang out and answer some questions on there as well. So thank you, Mel, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me and finally tracking me down to get me.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and everything that you guys have been studying is just, I'm a lake, I love lake water quality, so it's great to see. Monica, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have two. One person is wondering if you know of any research papers about nutrient cycling in quagga mussels.
Yeah, sure. There are a few. Actually, if you email me, b.ginn@lsrca.on.ca, I'd be happy to send some for you. They're not my papers, but there's been some recent ones that came out. There's been some work in the Great Lakes region. One came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences back in February or March, I think. And there's one that's coming out in Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences just this month, I think, or next month. There's a preview that's online, but I have copies of those and I'd be happy to send them out if people want them.
Okay, I just put your email in the chat. Someone else is wondering if pH on Lake Simcoe plays a role in the success of the Starry stonewort.
Yeah, absolutely. They seem to prefer alkaline lakes. So pH in Lake Simcoe is around 8.4. So it seems to prefer lakes that are kind of on the alkaline side of the spectrum. So 7.5 up to 8.5 or so. It's also calcium requirements as well. It seems to need a calcium concentration of between 20 and 60 milligrams per liter. There was a researcher at Ontario Tech University that did his PhD thesis on that. So any lake that's on limestone seems to be susceptible to it. I've got some colleagues up in the Muskoka lakes where they're on granite and kind of the Canadian Shield bedrock. They seem to be buffered. They don't have the right requirements for starry stonewort. So I haven't seen it there, but anything with kind of an alkaline pH and lots of calcium in the water, that's exactly what starry stonewort loves. So.
Okay, someone is wondering how extensive quagga mussel distribution is across Ontario.
I think they're mostly everywhere, certainly across Trent Severn Waterway. I know they're up the Rideau Canal for sure, all across Lake Ontario, across Lake Erie, Great Lakes, shorelines, Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, for example. So, zebra mussels, certainly, I remember from my days at Queen's, zebra mussels were in Lake Appinicon on the Rideau Canal. I'm not sure if quagga mussels were there then, they might be now, but again, it's a lot of people can't tell the two species apart, so they call everything a zebra mussel, and they're actually quagga mussels. So, yeah.
All right. And then someone is wondering if Lake Simcoe had, so you said it had Eurasian water milfoil, and
Yep.
then how are you handling it now?
Yeah, Eurasian water milfoil got into the lake around 1983, I think, and that took over the entire shallow water habitat, so it restructured all the habitat. But once Starry stonewort came in, it tended to eliminate Eurasian water milfoil. So there were some places where they were harvesting it, so they were kind of basically mowing your lake and cutting the tops off these aquatic plants to kind of keep it in check, but that's more really an aesthetic reason for like shoreline owners and that sort of thing. It doesn't really do anything much. And also all those fragments from the cuttings, wherever they kind of wash away, they'll start an entire new colony wherever they land. So yeah, so the problem now is Starry stonewort, and yeah, Eurasian water milfoil is still there in some places, but Starry stonewort completely took over the shallow water habitat from it.
Okay. And then there's one last one just asking if you would focus limited money on helping protect inland lakes, as this is the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, keep invasive species out. So, I mean, if you can have like a lake steward that kind of monitors a boat launch or something like that, just give a trailer and a boat kind of a once over, check for mussels and aquatic plants on the outside, remove those. And same thing, get your cottage association or your lake association, plant buffer zones, have people maintain their septic systems. They're the easiest things that you can do.
Perfect. That's all of the questions.
Great. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
We had a blast having you here. And if you email Mike your address, we'll get you your bottle of syrup.
Great. I love maple syrup. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.